Okay, we are going to begin. How's everybody doing? Well, good. My name is Ben Manski. I'm at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm a doctoral in sociology there. And I am very pleased to be able to make this panel of papers and the discussion that will follow available to all of you. We're also recording so that this will be available to you later on and to others who are interested. This is a session on the critical search for theoretical relevance in social movement studies considered internationally. That has been a theme for the sessions of our research clusters, 47 and 48, throughout this week. But what I think you're going to find that is a little bit different is, well, I mean, there have been so many great talks, but these are going to be the best talks to bring in a little bit from our unfortunate president. So I would like to just introduce the speakers representing their work. And then what we're going to do is we'll hear the papers. We'll have a discussion that is first led off by Alf Nilsen, who's sitting in the front here. And then we will also hear a brief presentation of one of the distributed papers. And we'll open it up to discussion. So that's basically the gist of it. I'll let all of you know that I will be sitting right over there. I will give you hand signals so you can look for those, and there won't be anything too complicated. So sitting immediately to my right, and this is not the speaker order, but sitting immediately to my right is Dr. Helena Flam. Then you have right here you have Madelaine Moore. You have Paul Rebughini. You have Ralph-Armbruster-Sandoval. And then Hao Shi, or Ryan, and then finally Maarit Laihonen. So please welcome them. A little bit of applause is a good way to start. And we're going to start off with a presentation from Madelaine Moore. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed these papers. Really fantastic work.
Okay. Yeah, thank you all for coming. Yeah, this is a presentation of an article that me and my colleague Anne Engelhardt co-wrote and was published in Momentum Quarterly at the end of last year. Yeah, the main background of this paper is that we wanted to try and provoke a bit of a dialogue between critical political economy and social movement studies. And part of that is we're both doing research on different sorts of social movements or labour movements, and we came into quite a bit of, I don't know, I suppose, trouble in trying to engage with the social movement literature because we came from more of a political economy background. And then, well, how do we make these two schools of thought that should be talking to each other talk to each other more? And yeah, so then we kind of went back and tried to work out how we could do this. And this is the outcome. Which is still an ongoing project as part of our PhD. And part of this is also we got quite into sort of dialectical thinking and how we could apply this to social movements, which we think, you know, by definition are moving things. And so it would be great to try and find some sort of methodology that captures that movement rather than tries to fit it into more of a static category. So I think from what I've been seeing yesterday, I've only been here yesterday, in this stream, there were some really interesting papers from both of you two actually in the front, which are like basically dealing with the same issues that I'm dealing with and Anna was also dealing with. So I won't go into too much detail about that because I think if you've been here to previous sessions, I'm basically on the same page as them. But partly this is, yeah, social movement studies. I feel like it often is limited to description, kind of how questions, and here I'm talking mostly about American social movement studies because in one paper you can't talk about the whole body of work, but it's somewhat limited to what can be seen. And this ends up creating or trying to create these sort of, I feel like a pretension almost of neutral categories. And I would come up from this from a position where there is no really such thing as neutral categories. We all come with some sort of theoretical baggage, and it would be more, I think, honest in a sense to try and work out what that is and how we're applying that in a kind of clear way. And then from the other side, there's critical political economy that often is kind of divided into this domination or disruption school. It talks a lot about the state, talks about institutions, capitalist hegemony and the processes behind reasserting that capitalist hegemony, but quite often misses that disruption and the actual like contestation that goes through for that hegemony to kind of take place. So a kind of really simplified version of what we've been talking about is we feel like social movement studies looks at struggle but not class. Critical political economy looks at class but not struggle. And we want to talk about class struggle. Yeah, that's kind of the background of the paper. And part of this is looking at a more like nuanced understanding of structure and agency being something that feeds into each, rather than a kind of preference for one or the other kind of causality. Yeah, and so we're trying to retool the tools in a way to do this. And part of the critical political economy perspective, I think, is that it really talks about processes, and these processes remain quite abstract. And what I think is useful about social movement studies methods, I think this is where it's more of a method rather than necessarily a theory sometimes, is that it's talking about this being more of the micro level. And what I would like to try and talk about is how these processes are always lived by people and struggled over by people. So it's that movement from the abstract to the concrete that kind of needs to be navigated. So, yes, social movement studies, and this is a picture that me and Anna came up with to try and visualize it for ourselves, but we think it's a volcano. A lot of it, what we feel like, is that it kind of focuses on what is above the black line. The moments of eruption, it counts how many people are there, how hot the lava is, these sorts of processes, but it ignores the processes and the historical and contextual elements that go into creating those moments of eruption. So therefore the movement becomes almost a static category, it becomes closed, and yeah, I think has some sort of connection to the history of social movement studies from in the American tradition, where the movement was seen as a moment of aberration, as something that needs to be controlled. So this is a way of understanding it to control it rather than understanding of it to push it forward. And I think we're coming at it from more of a, well, clearly Marxist position where we would like to push the potentiality of these struggles when there is potentiality there. So it's a very different starting point and looking at why. So, in our own research, what we got to was how do the current methodologies, because I don't think, what I find problematic sometimes is there is a tradition of saying, well, all that movement or all that school is problematic and bad and there's nothing good to rescue from it. I think there is some really good stuff to rescue from social movement studies, and I think it can be re-embedded in a more like politicized perspective. And so we went and had a look at Tilly Tower, and we had him as the kind of godfathers of the American school. And I think there was an interesting transition in some of their work from, you have the dynamics of contention in 2001, and then this is after Tilly passed away, but in 2010, Ballots and Barricades was an interesting sort of return to their work and looking at what was missing and what were the gaps that they could fill. And I think there's still some things there that can be useful, and they started to move into a more processual kind of understanding and more trying to catch the movement of movements. I don't think they went further enough, and I think that's what we're trying to do here in this paper, is push it further. But some of the interesting things that they did start to talk about was really trying to move beyond old and new divisions, which Anna works more on labour movements, I look more on sort of traditional social movements. And we always had this issue, it's like, I don't think there is this clear division. And how can we create a methodology that doesn't have that clear division there? I think they were starting to talk about this. Also, they start to look at more contentious politics as a broader thing, a flexibility of terms there, and it's a longer time scale. So therefore it becomes, not just the social movement or the protest, but that can feed into election cycles, that can feed into revolutions and so on. It also becomes more process and actor orientated to a point. And yeah, try to start to talk about mechanisms being less static tools of analysis. And so they introduced this idea, they kind of, in dynamics of contention, they had 18 big mechanisms or tools, and they sort of reduced that to 3 in Ballots and Barricades, called the environmental, cognitive, and relational mechanism. So this was kind of our starting point. But yeah, obviously we have issues with this, is why we didn't just go ahead and use this and apply this to our case studies. And part of this is really like the state state here is talked about as almost a neutral actor or a neutral field of contention, whereas we would really say it's definitely an embedded power relation and is more than just a political institution. It's also somewhat limited to the field of existing structures, so it doesn't necessarily allow for movements to move beyond what already exists. And there is an element there that's still trying to develop a general theory of social movements. And from my own sort of ontological epistemological position, I think that is incredibly problematic. And I would say that actually a lot of what they're using here and the mechanisms they're developing are really interesting and useful methodological tools rather than general theory frameworks, which I think is an important distinction to make. You also have the social movement as an object, and it's a particular vantage point. For us, we would say that the social movement is an interesting vantage point to then look at the wider world and the wider dynamics and kind of ecology that the movement is operating in, rather than a closed thing that's looking inward to itself. So we're starting from slightly different positions. It's also not sufficiently place and time bound, and I think this is where historical materialism has a really important input to looking at how important time and space and the unevenness of those processes are for understanding movements. And so yeah, it still has this linear causality, and that's I think partly a remnant of where they're coming from and where they're writing from, and maybe who they're writing for as well. So there is a need for an embedded historical materialist method. This is the point of trying to look at what is below the volcano. Why is the volcano erupting? Why then? Where? All these things that get lost if you only look at the moments of protest. So here we're saying that the movement is not operating on a space, it's operating in, with, and on. This is the deep ontology claim, kind of critical realism is kind of maybe where we first started out on, where the social whole, there is a social whole and there's like a systemic whole that we can talk about. This doesn't mean that it's equal and even and flat across the whole world, everything is capitalist in the same level, but at an abstract level we can talk about a systemic whole. And we can never fully grasp or comprehend what that whole is. So therefore we need different vantage points, we need different moments and different geographies to start to build up an understanding of how that operates and how it works. And this is where the social movement, I think, is a really critical vantage point onto that whole, because it's already the moment of struggle. It's the moment where people are contesting and they're starting to develop some sort of consciousness about the issues and problems that they're facing, and maybe link that to systemic problems as well. This is where, it's unevenly lived. So, we might talk about accumulation by dispossession, and that might operate very differently for Aboriginal Australians than it does for a white person from Melbourne. And the key concepts here that we're trying to develop and link to some of the tools developed by Tilly, Tower, and McAdam are contradictions, social whole, internal relations, and abstractions. I think abstraction is a really important methodological tool because you can start to talk about systems and then get to the micro levels. And then from this, it does have a clearly political potential that we're trying to develop. So, hurry up. They developed cognitive, relational, and environmental mechanisms, and we're trying to develop them and talk about them as dynamics instead of mechanisms. So I think dynamic captures the processuality of this and the movement of the terms. So for them, cognitive was basically framing the interpretive processes. The relational was how coalition building, kind of networking analysis, and the environmental was the external variables such as the political opportunities and threats. We think that it's still a kind of atomistic idea of these things. We want to bring those elements into relation with each other. So we change the contradictions in the cognitive dynamic. And this is where the internal cognitive processes are now linked to contradictions. So this is moving from, a kind of not just framing the problem, but maybe potentially linking that problem to systemic issues. Going deeper than just the rubbish tip that's going to be built at the end of your street, to why does this rubbish tip need to be there? Why and not in the very wealthy neighbourhood next door? We believe that movements and people are the ones who activate these contradictions. So it's lived through human activity. This is kind of E.P. Thompson stuff here. And this is where these processes need to we start to thought about and brought in relation with each other. It's also how movements create boundaries of us and them, how, you know, a kind of the movement identity is formed. So in this way, it is still kind of the framing that is traditionally used in social movement studies, but we're trying to link it to kind of a deeper ontology. And here it's also this shift from quantity to quality, so locating it in historical processes beyond just the moment. Then the next one is shifting the environmental mechanism to the environmental dynamic, linking this to the social whole. And this is where it's not just threats and opportunities or them acting on their environment, but instead it's a non-aggregative social whole, so every moment or movement in that whole is going to affect everything else there too. So there's, yeah, a shift across and within. The movement is acting in its environment, the environment is also acting and limiting the movement. And here, I won't talk about it at all, but I'll just say that social reproduction theory is what we're really based this on, and I think it's a really important feminist Marxist analysis for what is capitalism, and it's a much broader, less reductive perspective on capitalism and Marxism there. And yeah, read the paper if you want to know more about how we analyse that. The next one is the organisational dynamic and social reproduction theory, which is again quite similar to what they talk about the relational mechanism, but we are using relations in a different way here. So we've shifted it to organisational dynamic. So in some ways it is the networks, it's internal linkages across spaces of struggle, looking beyond just the moment of protest to include how those protests are developed, the kind of maintenance of the movements, and also how they break down and move over time and feed into new movements, so movement waves. And then we've added the institutional dynamic, which is basically talking about, I think, the state and the capitalist state in particular is a very important field of struggle. And here, Colin's us we found quite useful because he talks about the state being the material condensation of power relations. So in some ways, this is the kind of institutionalization of previous struggles. It is kind of channeled and limited, and also has avenues through the state to kind of push open certain cleavages. So it's trying to also understand the state not as one monolithic tool or block, but saying that there's different parts of it, that the social movements can interact with, can get involved in, can also be like locked out of. So as a conclusion, this is our way again, like we're so quite visual people, we try and work out what we're trying to say in pictures, is that these are sort of all working together. They're not a linear causality, it's all trying to kind of shift one, shifts others, but this is a way of building, I suppose, an analytical abstraction to try and understand the movements that we're looking at. They're all interconnected and feed into each other, and yeah, we're trying to analyse more than just the moment of eruption, but look at it as a process and a kind of snapshot of a certain moment in time of that process. And yeah, that each vantage point and each movement that we start to look at will help add and make push our understanding of what this social world is that we live in. And that's it. But yeah, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Madelaine Moore. As is probably pretty obvious, I'm a sparing chair, but I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that Eiji was also one of our panelists, and he was unable to come because of the flooding in Japan. So I just wanted to acknowledge his work, and also to acknowledge my co-organizer of the session, Maria Martinez, who's not here because she has a newborn child in Spain, but we're recording this session for her as well. So without any further introduction, let's bring up the next set of slides here. That will be with Helena Flam. I'll pull something up, we'll see who it is. Nope, that was the one we just did. This one? Yes, okay. Slideshow. All right, please welcome Helena Flam.
Okay, let me try to do it in 15 minutes. I should emphasize that this is based on a paper for a handbook of regional and transnational studies, for which I was asked to write a paper on how to study transnational movements. So this is not so much about theorizing about it, but at the same time, I hope to, it's a propaganda piece for, or a case, trying to make a case for the importance of doing transnational studies. So, why take interest in transnational movements? Well, because as far as we can tell, they are more numerous and influential, at least since the 1980s. And they even have led, this phenomenon has led even to the reconceptualization of the international relations to include NGOs and transnational movements as important actors in the international relations. And it is also my motivation to write about such topics comes out of my observation that quite a lot of social movement research focuses on single, local or national movements, and that we seem to be standing in one place, not moving ahead. So it's, in a way, what I'm trying to do is to facilitate the task of moving ahead. And I certainly do not, this is a mistake, I'm not going to show that it is important to study transnational social movements. What I want to argue is that, or to say is that we are missing the important movements and phenomena of the day when we stick to local and national movements, that we do not spend enough energy thinking about militarization, Russianization, financialization, and looking at the movements directly directed against them. And in a different piece, I made an argument based on review of literature that we have very many studies that focus on anti-austerity movements, but it is not the same as focusing on anti-financialization movements. The actors are different, the targets are different, and so on. And as I said, it's a propaganda shtick. What I want to show is that it is not more labor costly, no more intensive to do this sort of transnational research than to do research on local or international movements. But in preparing this presentation, I thought, why don't I, before I will show you several examples, that is what will happen in the second part of my presentation, but I thought to myself, well, why don't I look at the literature that I had reviewed and see what it tells me about the development of transnational movements. And to my own surprise, I discovered something that I wasn't, at least myself, I wasn't aware of it. Maybe there are some books that make this point, but as I just said, I wasn't aware of it. And I'll get to this point in a second. First, this is maybe forgotten, and that's why there will be a conference on it in Brighton in June next year, that the 1960s were not just about the student movement, but very importantly and crucially about solidarity with the Third World and decolonialization struggle movements. And these have been understudied as transnational movements. Then at the same time, we had the emergence of the fair trade movement, which was emerged on the one hand from the religious corner, so to speak, of the world, and on the other hand from the left-wing student movement. And then in the 1980s, global movements, I think this is like shared knowledge, the anti-apartheid, the anti-government debt, human rights, environmental movement. That's, I think there's nothing surprising here. What surprised me was what you see on this slide, that there have been so many studies of regional movements without this being like signaled and labeled and trumpeted across social movement studies. As I said, maybe I'm maybe that's just my vision based on the overview of the literature, but coalitions against NAFTA and FTAA were studied, and people are aware of these studies, but these are coalitions, but these are sort of about regional politics, not global politics. There are quite a few studies of environmental and women's movements within the EU. I cite here only what I cited in my paper, but of course I am aware, for example, of the work of Dieter Rucht on the role of the environmental movements within the EU. So there's another regional study. And then later on, studies on regional networks against huge government projects and environmental destruction in Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. So, but what we are aware of, and that's the final part of this sort of chronological overview of periodization, are of course global justice movements, Mercanton summits, social fora, and so on. We all know that these have been studied at the forefront of our awareness. I would argue much less, okay, so this is the periodization that emerged when I looked at the literature I reviewed in my literature, in the article that I mentioned before, and as I said, it brought a little surprise, at least for me. And now I will move on and tell you about a couple of studies or approaches to the studies of approaches to transnational movements, and what I find, why they make me happy or unhappy. Okay, the ones that I started with were well-known studies by Donatella Della Porta of the Social Forum in Florence, Jackie Smith's several studies of global movements, but what I didn't, and I listed what such studies or research projects usually take up. Social demographics of the participants, the issues discussed during the meeting, actions, events, values, norms, prehistory, not very often the outcomes. That's one thing that I find frustrating, that people who write about coalitions that emerge out of these meetings are like a different group of researchers. And for me, this stands for in situ, on the place, on the spot research, which focuses on the history, ideas, networking. Initially had very little to say about the lines of exclusion and power, but it doesn't address, to my mind, the question of transnationality. So what is transnational about these movements? Apart from the fact that people from different continents or countries are meeting there. And here is one example of a study which attempts to take up, to speak of transnationality, to look at coalition building within the, against NAFTA, and to raise the question under which conditions coalitions or networks of different organizations come together, under which conditions they overcome mutual mistrust. That's the assumption in this article. One can quarrel with it, but the question of whether or not such networks have successful brokers and whether they need them is an interesting question. A question of solidarity, loyalty versus as I said, mistrust and hostility is, as it turns out, one question that one could study. And in this case, the author, and that's my point, it can be done, even for a PhD study. In this case, the author does just send out a survey, and anybody can do it. Email. She also then followed up with on face-to-face interviews with selected people to clarify and enhance her analysis. But that's basically it. Oops, sorry. This is an example from my own research in transnational movement research. We often have, I said that in the abstract, we very often have the question, the classical question posed by Sekinik by a classical article in this area and extended by Taro, where the question is, do transnational social movement organizations take up local issues or vice versa? Do local movements import transnational issues? And what you see here instead is a question, can we speak of a transnational movement on a specific topic, looking by different discourses developed by public intellectuals, by humanitarian and human rights organizations, by the UN, and so on. You can multiply it now, but it's a different research approach. It's not about import-export of ideas. It's about looking at how widespread the discourse is and what are the differences possibly between different, more or less institutionalized actors that spread it. Here is another example from Leipzig, Germany. We are very proud to have had some research on transnational social movements. Here, this is an example or this is a case of a transnational movement being conceptualized like a commodity chain. The question is, who the focus is on fair trade and what happened to it over time. And the PhD looked at how the initial fair trade idea became split into the fair trade and fair trade labor idea. Who are the decision makers, how they make decisions about respective parts of, or how they what it is that they want to achieve, but he didn't stay with that. He didn't just look at the Western generators of this movement. He went to Peru and Mexico, to different sites, to ask what the producers there thought of the solidarity movement in which they supposedly play a part. Here, another one that I'm very enthusiastic about. It's a book that just came out, based on what the book says and also my own interviews. I can say that following biographies of activists and or experts and or professionals who are involved in transnational social movements, one can trace very easily the trajectory of a movement. I tried to show how the trajectory, or what social anthropologists would call scales, changed in the over time. The early active research and activists on behalf of the victims of the Minamata disease and on behalf of environment started in Japan. It moved to the international or transnational level, if you want. No, international, because this was a meeting of different member states and different NGOs coming from. It moved to Sweden, where there was a great exchange of ideas between people concerned with the environment and with industrial pollution and the diseases it produces. And then 2 decades later, you find the same people active at the UN level, and they are making for an argument that the Japanese movement disappeared. There is no movement. Well, it still exists, only at a different scale or at a different level. And then if you look at the most recent developments, you will find these Japanese activists, researchers, lawyers, and so on, active at 3 different levels. I'm almost done. If I can, I would show you one more. This one is for grabs. I didn't get money for it. We have, at the same time as you, I hope you hear it, I'm trying to tell you that there are different kinds of transnational movements, and that when they raise different kinds of problems, and that one also needs to study them in using very different approaches. This one is a potential research project for a study of global justice and the cooperation between the International Criminal Court in The Hague and the global civil society. Probably not many of you know that this court in The Hague was set up with the help of many transnational non-governmental organizations. They played a crucial role during the negotiations leading up to the decision to set it up in 2002. And ever since 2004, I suppose, in The Hague, there is an umbrella organization gathering 2,500 NGOs from different countries that support the work of the International Criminal Court. And they have their headquarters, their representatives in The Hague, but they are, of course, the people who do the actual work are in different locations all over the globe. So this is another idea of how one can study. This is a movement for global justice, which has an institutional and an NGO, transnational and local NGO element or part. And it would be very nice to see an actual research project on how this works together. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Pull up the next of the slides. Maarit Laihonen. Yeah. Everything goes into a Wisconsin accent. There we go. Beautiful. I'll let you handle it from there. Please welcome Maarit Laihonen.
Okay, so my name is Maarit, and I probably fully misread the description of this track because I am not, it seems that I'm going to speak a little bit of different things. So here on the title slide, you see a cape where there are 2 cottages, and I will speak to you about 1-year protest camp in northern Finland in Europe, and how to theorize based on ethnographic data collected from there. And this is very much a work in progress thing. So I will actually not speak so much about theory, although there's a literature slide and there are drafts of papers and so on and so forth. But I'm concentrating on how to actually bring something new, bring new understanding from the everyday interactions to the social movements. And I believe that these issues, these practices are shared across the world in different movements. There is some literature on that, but I think there is also a need to go a bit further to actually look what happens in the everyday. So here's how we're going to do it. I will talk a little bit about the backgrounds to give some context, because that's a very, very important issue. And then a little bit of the focus, and then about what we normally see on protests or movements. This was discussed yesterday in one track, quite a bit of how to call these. I just call it protest because the activists themselves call it protest, so I think it's fair. And then I'm going to what actually interests me, the activities and organizing them. And I'll speak a little bit about the end or possible abeyance of the protests that is going back to the context and wider social movement issues, and then some reflections. So here you see, this is this picture is taken from Fennovoima Nuclear Power Company website, and it is a picture of what the possible nuclear power plants will be. So the company was established in 2007 in order to build a fully new nuclear site in Finland. And this is revolutionary in a sense that in Western countries, in Europe, Finland was the forerunner in 2002, starting to work on nuclear new builds after the Chernobyl disaster in the end of 1980s. So my country is very enthusiastic with these projects, although they tend to fail because, as said, the company was established in 2007, and the facility was meant to operate actually already this year, so they're also really slow in doing that. But however, they started some preparatory works a couple of years ago in April 2015, which also was kind of the birth date of the protest camp. And for those who don't know where Finland is, and definitely not where Pyhäjoki is, Pyhäjoki is 3,000 people municipality over there. I guess it would be somewhere in Alaska, looking from here. And here we go back to the actual cave. So this photo is taken after some of the works were already done probably in summer, late summer 2016, when the protest camp was already evicted. But where all of the action started was actually inside the construction area, which meant that at that time it was what we could call like a full-time occupation camp. So not just a protest, but occupation. So just by like not even by doing anything specifically, but being there, the camp was able to prevent, for example, forest cuttings at certain areas, and then some works at the seaside for 4 to 5 months. So these are the physical realities of the camp, seen from further away. So I got interested in the camp because it's very exceptional in Finland. There is a long tradition, long and successful tradition of such camps. For example, in France, UK, some of the original UK camps still actually live against nuclear arms. And also in US, we see repeatedly big such physical protests against, quite often they're actually energy related protests that are resisted. So there was something, because we have a long history of very destructive, large-scale industrial projects, but we don't have this like direct action history related to them. So there have been possibilities. The Finnish police forces have not been too violent against small resistance earlier. So there have been quite much possibilities, but for some reason, only in 2015 spring, 4 activists decided that there needs to be something more sustaining to protest this specific project. And what I want to say in this specific writing project is that these frames that have been discussed since Monday here also very widely, we can look at the, for example, such protests lifespan, but we cannot understand how they actually live through every day, because we all know that there is, for example, the constant threat of eviction, there are not formal organizations, and so on and so forth. So we don't have certain structures that normally would keep them alive. And of course, questions of mobilization and so on and so forth are interesting. But I think there was so much more from ethnographic data that could be drawn for a little bit different kind of analysis. So this is why I would like to concentrate on the everyday practices of repeatedly renegotiating common rules, values, and of course sharing the actual work and also the roles in those action situations, which we will see in just a second. I won't go to this role issue too much here actually because I decided not to speak about it. So getting back to this, what we normally see of resistance is something very public, and for example, the visuals of nuclear protests are these yellow and black and red since 1970s. There is media. This one is specifically they only do environmental resistance, a US-based journal. The organization, I think it was actually established in the UK, but no. Okay. Well, they have like some chapter there. So for this specific camp in that faraway village in Finland, it was very important that we got the visibility in such a meaningful journal, but also in traditional media, but of course in a very different way, and not giving the voice to the activists themselves. And then there are these actual actions blocking the works that we can see, which is another question of organizing. A very interesting one, how to take responsibilities in those situations. Probably a project as itself to discuss about that. However, it's not so chaotic what we would think from the what we see in public. Quite often, protest organizations follow some kind of anarchistic rules, anarchistic organization, which is, I would say, that although it's very much based on freedom, it is also extremely strict and stresses the meaning of responsibility, which we here see as, unfortunately, I don't have the task lists as very good photos, and police destroyed them in the end. But there are schedules, and you can probably imagine that there are always somebody who has to take care of the breakfast, doing the dishes, and so on and so forth. But of course, the organization will also have a little bit of fun at some point, because no organization lives only for work. So sauna and disco when you get out of the jail. Somebody apparently forgot to roast pizza there. That's also essential. So here is what I will look at are things such as cooking practices and other practices related to food, that is building of ground cellar to keep the food fresh, whether cold in the summer or not frozen in the winter, so it works for both. And this one actually worked. It doesn't always work to build this, but this one was a success. And how in these situations people interact, how the things are agreed and negotiated. And then there are kind of like side activities, but important for health. For example, during those times when it's impossible to block roads or other stuff, there are sports. So how to organize health-related issues. Then communications, normally done at night when everybody is too tired already to do that. And then basic living, like when it's, for example, minus 30 Celsius degrees, the camp couldn't afford enough wood, which meant that 7 people had to stuck into that little thingy, which was called bankruptcy, and how it's also, although it's extremely stressing, but how it also creates the community day to day. But eventually, such protests sometimes do face those institutions where they work within, and that is the state. And in Finnish case, the threat of eviction became extremely concrete. So the unsuccessfulness of the camp cannot be understood only as a failure of the camp itself, but it's also related to Finnish culture. This not getting used to protests, direct action, civil disobedience, and so on and so forth, which I will need to actually dig much more in the history, like how is it so that quite suddenly this decision was made, and this is definite, so the camp cannot return anymore. And that's like the physical destruction done by the police forces. So it's not only mental eviction, it's also very physical in all possible ways. So I'm a little bit repeating myself. So I believe that these contexts, culture, have an effect, and they relate to wider issues in social movements, but there are also these everyday things that we need to look at and combine these in order to understand why in quite harsh environments such protest lives, and what motivates and creates the collectivity even though in those. And of course, this will be somehow linked to the solidarity, because somebody always did the dishes. So I believe that in everyday that solidarity is actually built, whether it's explicitly negotiated or just in those interactions. I think that's it. And I'm almost in time, Eva. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maarit. And that was bringing back memories of winter encampments with Earth First in Wisconsin, in about the same temperatures back at 20 plus years ago for me. How are you all doing? It feels like there's pretty good energy in the room. Does anybody need to stand up and stretch? Do you want to take a stretch break? Stretch. As we do with movement organizations, we're all biological creatures, right? Okay, good. Excellent. So let me bring up the slides here for Ralph-Armbruster-Sandoval. And let's scan this. Please welcome Ralph-Armbruster-Sandoval.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Hope you're having a great day. Thanks for organizing the panel, and look forward to our conversation, remaining comments too from everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a book that I published last year with the University of Arizona Press. It's called what's it called? Starving for Justice, Spectacular Speech, Hunger Strikes, and the Struggle for Dignity, okay? And it has a little bit of empirical and theoretical focus, right? And so it's a series of case studies that look at these 3 hunger strikes that took place on California campuses in the 1990s. UC Santa Barbara, where I teach, and Ben is also there, at UCLA and Stanford, okay? So those are the kind of like the backbone. And prior to doing that, I wanted to look at the whole reasons why people went into hunger striking in the first place. And you see something here about the Chicano and Chicano movement. One of the things that frustrated me going into this is that I felt like the social movement scholars hadn't really examined the Chicano movement. Then a lot of stuff on the Black freedom movement, civil rights movement, maybe feminist movement, maybe other kinds of movements, but I felt, maybe with the exception of the farm workers, UFW, not a lot had been done about that. And so I really want to focus on, rather than, of course, in 14 minutes, to talk about everything. I'm just going to focus on UCSB, but initially I want to talk to you all a little bit about what I mean by spectacular speech. I guess that was my novel breakthrough. Maybe it's not that novel, because you're always building on the giants of others. But what do I mean by spectacular speech? Here's a little clip from the show called The Newsroom. This is not a social movement setting, but it kind of gets at what we're talking about.
Diversity and opportunity.
There's freedom and freedom. So let's keep it that way.
Well, why is it not the greatest country in the world, Professor? That's my answer.
You're saying
Yes.
Let's talk about
Fine. Sharon, the NEA is a loser. Yeah, it accounts for a penny out of her paycheck, but he gets to hit you with it anytime he wants. It doesn't cost money. It costs votes. It costs airtime, column inches. You know why people don't like liberals? Because they lose. If liberals are so fucking smart, how come they lose their goddamn always? Hey, and with a straight face, you're going to tell students that America is so star-spangled awesome that we're the only ones in the world who have freedom? Canada has freedom. Japan has freedom. The UK, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Australia, Belgium has freedom. So 207 sovereign states in the world, like 180 of them have freedom. All right, and yeah, you, sorority girl, just in case you accidentally wander into a voting booth one day, there's some things you should know. One of them is, there's absolutely no evidence to support the statement that we're the greatest country in the world. We're 7th in literacy, 27th in math, 22nd in science, 49th in life expectancy, 178th in infant mortality, 3rd in median household income, number 4 in labor force, and number 4 in exports. We lead the world in only 3 categories: number of incarcerated citizens per capita, number of adults who believe angels are real, and defense spending, where we spend more than the next 26 countries combined, 25 of whom are allies. Now, none of this is the fault of a 20-year-old college student, but you nonetheless are, without a doubt, a member of the worst period, generation, period, ever, period. So when you ask what makes us the greatest country in the world, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Yosemite? Sure used to be. We stood up for what was right. We fought for moral reasons. We passed laws, struck down laws for moral reasons. We waged wars on poverty, not poor people. We sacrificed. We cared about our neighbors. We put our money where our mouths were, and we never beat our chest. We built great big things, made ungodly technological advances, explored the universe, cured disease, and we cultivated the world's greatest artists and the world's greatest economy. We reached for the stars, acted like men. We aspired to intelligence. We didn't belittle it. It didn't make us feel inferior. We didn't identify ourselves by who we voted for in the last election, and we didn't scare so easy. We were able to be all these things and do all these things because we were informed by great men, men who were revered. First step in solving any problem is recognizing there is one. America is not the greatest country in the world anymore. Enough?
Can you say why America is the greatest?
Okay. So a lot of nostalgia there, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this is what Jeff Daniels is trying to articulate. But the idea is, generally speaking, I thought this was good kind of visual representation of what an activist is trying to do. He, she, somebody who's basically trying to engage you is trying to basically get you to listen. As we would say, don't you know what's going on here, right? So the idea is, can you hear me now, right? The old cell phone conversations, I can't hear you, right? And so your voice is not being picked up here. What'd you say again? So all the folks out in the audience, can I do this? All the folks in the audience are out there, I'm sorry, at home. They're out there with kids, and they're looking at their cell phones, and we do that here. I do it, right? So the notion basically is people are being distracted, right? They're being distracted by somebody else, and the idea of the activist is, pay attention, wake up, don't look down, look up, right? I'm really talking with some passion and substance here. I want you to listen to me, and that's what Jeff Daniels said. Can you state what makes America the greatest country? Somebody on the left, so-called left, says diversity and opportunity, and the other guy goes freedom and freedom on the right? And so he's like saying, listen, should I go for it or not? We're not the greatest country. We're a piece of shit. And these are the reasons why, right? And so what happens basically in the audience is instead of going down here like this, let me check Facebook, let me start, shopping at the Gap or something like that. Let me start actually filming this and start listening, right? So it's very hard to be heard. Somebody must do something spectacular or dramatic in order to be heard, right? And so when I first started doing this research, I was, a lot of people like to talk over dinner or whatever. What are you doing your work on? I said, I'm doing work on hunger strikes. Oh, how unfortunate for you. And so what I began to think about is, the people are doing something dramatic and being heard are not just people that are going on hunger strikes. Mohamed Bouazizi, this Tunisian street vendor, lit himself on fire, right? The tactic of self-immolation as a weapon of the weak, began to look at hunger striking. So then I said, yeah, I'm studying people are going on hunger strikes and people are lighting themselves on fire. Nervous silence ensued, So his, if you know the story about what he did there, of course, his action really sparked a flame, literally speaking, within, population there. Dictatorship ruled for 30 years, fell. Of course, that action then led to kind of what, social movement people call spillover effects. I don't like that word, but led this kind of this dispersion. It led to the Arab Spring, led to Occupy Wall Street, right? A lot of people say, Professor, I'm just one person, I can't do anything. Well, there's 7 billion people in the world, and this guy Bouazizi did something really important. What were the impacts of that? We can talk about that later, but it did lead to something pretty big. Mohamed Bouazizi, Thich Dug, of course, a famous Vietnamese monk who lit himself on fire, which Rage Against the Machine reproduced this image on their album back in 1981. I'm sure some of you remember that. So back to this notion, just in terms of social, how am I doing, Ben? 5 minutes, 6 minutes? You got 7 minutes, wonderful. So the notion of trying to think about this as a tactic, from a theoretical point of view, right? So I have the theoretical part, it's the first 2 chapters, and then I have these case studies that I look at, UCSB, UCLA, Stanford. A lot of people that have focused on these 2 tactics have really highlighted the contributions of men, right? And so what I try to do in my own, in terms of being an ally, I think, or also being an activist and somebody who's a scholar, is to try to open up that kind of perspective, right? So I want to go beyond that. Mealy Blackwell is a UCLA Chicano Studies professor. She wrote a book called Chicana Power. And in the very first chapter of that book, she says the telling is political. How we tell these tales is really important, right? Do we want to start the civil rights movement history with the Martin Kings and end them with his assassination, or Malcolm X, or John Lewis, right? Do we want to do that, right? And the Chicano movement history is what they call the 4 horsemen. A guy named, of course, Cesar Chavez, Jorge Gonzalez, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, another guy named Jose Angel Gutierrez, right? The movement began with men and it ended with men, and nothing ever happened before that or after that, right? It's a very gendered and very exclusionary way of telling these movement histories. A lot of people say, it would be great if we had these guys back again. Then we would have a movement, right? We're always going to be waiting. I'd like to show you a little clip, but I'm not going to, from this movie called Iron-Jawed Angels, which is about the suffragist movement. And I had never learned anything about the suffragist movement in school, right? And it took a long time for me to learn that. So in terms of thinking about where this tactic began, I began to look back and say, where did this tactic kind of start, right? It looks like it maybe, quote, started. You have a very problematic thing when you start saying something started. It's something because somebody will disprove you. But so the notion of where this maybe came from, so ironically, women were instrumental in pioneering and using this tactic, but over time, I usually ask my students, I say, name the most famous hunger strikers you can think of. They name Gandhi, they name Cesar Chavez, and if I'm lucky, somebody will say Bobby Sands. 3 guys, 3 men. Nobody will mention Alice Paul. Nobody will mention Iram Shamila. Iram Shamila was a woman in India who went on a hunger strike for 16 years. 16 years, off and on, cat and mouse game, where she nearly died. They force fed her, brought her back to life, back and forth. 16 years. You think if a man had been on a hunger strike for 16 years, we might know his name? So here's one of the famous of the women in England who were going on hunger strikes, pressed for the rights to vote. Iron Shamila went off her hunger strike recently, a couple of years ago now. These are, of course, Guantanamo Bay. A number of detainees there have been on hunger strikes. They're also men. Notice how, again, men get... Alice Paul and other suffragists in the early 20th century pioneered the tactic of demonstrating outside the White House. Some people know that, some people don't. Of course, in the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington, a number of people, family separations, have, of course, gotten a lot of news in the United States over the last few weeks. But those separations have been going on for a long time. This doesn't mean that it's... Anyway, it's been going on for a while, and hunger strikes have been taking place there. Just in terms of the context, right? So like the stuff bubbling below, I really like how you kind of put that earlier about, the stuff that made this happen. It's basically an anti-immigrant sentiment, this kind of anti-Latino. Like when I first started doing this research in, I think, 2011, 2012, many of the things that we're hearing about today are still things that we heard back in 1994. So this kind of like open season on immigrants, on Latinos. The free trade agreement had been put into effect. Budget cuts, rising tuition, you name it. It all added up to a kind of general feeling of being a war, right? And so this kind of war that was being enacted on people of color and also on Latinos, right? So people felt desperate, right? So why does somebody go on a hunger strike? As they say, like in the streets, desperate times call for desperate measures, right? Prop 187, students going on strike. This graphic here is just really striking. California in 1980, we had this prison building boom, 22 prisons, 1 university, right? Public education getting starved. The students, what did they want? They wanted basically no more fee increases. Fees had increased by 40% in 1993. The department that I teach in, they only had 3 professors. They wanted to increase to 15. They also wanted a doctoral program in Chicano studies. They wanted to recruit more Chicano students from the local surrounding areas. They wanted to maintain and rename this building, which was a sacred space on campus for organizing, for activism. They wanted to create a community center in Isla Vista, which is like a kind of student area, but it's not exclusively just students. Low-income families of color, mostly Latino families, who were being raided by the INS at that time. INS, which is the precursor to the ICE. And they wanted to ban table grapes from campus because the farm workers were being poisoned by pesticides, right? Let's get through a couple of these. One of the things I said in general, like all those things combined added up to this thing called dignity, right? They wanted greater dignity. And were they able to get it? I know I'm already running out of time here. A lot of times, we like to talk about what's the outcome, right? Social movement scholars want to know, did this thing really work? And well, so it was complicated, yes and no. And so were they able to get table grapes banned from campus? Yes, they were. Were they able to get a community center in Isla Vista? Yes, they did. They renamed this building and they kept this building after this, one of the founders of the student organization. We only had 10% of our population was Chicano Latino in 1994 when the strike happened. It increased to 27% over time, and today we're known as Hispanic Serving Institution. We created a PhD program in Chicano Studies. Do I got 1 minute? And we also hired more professors. In fact, if this hunger strike hadn't happened, I would have been hired in 1998. So 5 of the 6 demands, quote, worked. But fees were not frozen, and fees have increased by 300% since the year 2000. And so on one hand, you can say, yeah, it worked. But on every other demand, 20 to 25 years later, there's been significant backsliding, right? So the question is, like I try to, end, is that what's it going to take basically to interrupt what we're seeing in the world right now? Do we need more spectacular speech? And one of the things that's really heavy on my heart, I went to this presentation earlier about what's going on in Syria, and refugees, and of course the family separation crisis. I've been talking with my colleagues, like, how can we stop this? Do we need more spectacular speech? I'm not sure if that's the notion that would work, but it needs to stop, and how are we going to do that? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ralph. We have our last oral presentation, then we will have some comments from our discussant, and then we'll also hear briefly about one of the distributed papers, and we'll open out to discussion. So please welcome Paul Rebughini. And you have slides up here, is that right? Yes. The name, that's missing. Thank you so much. Please welcome.
Okay, thank you. So we started by a theoretical presentation. We finished with a theoretical one. So sorry if I will not be very spectacular speech. Anyway, so for this last presentation, my aim is to offer a reflection around what critical theory can learn from social movements and how social movements produce critical theory locally, transnationally, and historically. So the aim is to offer a reflection on the transformations of critical agency inside social movements. And indeed, the possibility of critical capacity has been a fundamental stake of modern culture, while social movements have been the historical careers of such possibility and capacity of emancipation from forms of domination. In the last decades, there has been an important theoretical discussion on the way in which we can conceptualize critique and critical agency in a globalized, post-industrial, post-Eurocentric world. But this discussion has been often very abstract and disconnected from social movement studies and from empirical cases. So this presentation is mainly an attempt to bridge these two literature, organizing a sort of cartography of the encounter, focused on the transformation of critical patterns inside social movements. To do this, we have first to take into consideration a basic premise. We can establish that current social movements landscape is characterized by a multiplicity of social actors, groups, communities, and networks. On the one hand, they represent specific cultures, identities, and local claims. And on the other hand, they attempt to build transversal dialogues on common frames around transcultural and transnational meta issues such as global justice, democratization, critique of neoliberalism, dignity and human rights, in the attempt to construct a counter-hegemony, an alternative construction of reality through common processes of naming the action necessary to organize networks of solidarity and collective identity. So we can observe, on one hand, the difficulties in organizing a final coherent synthesis with one clear adversary, one unitary cause. And on the other hand, we observe the intertwinement of different critical issues into the same mobilization, usually with the intersection of gender, class, and ethnicity issues, and with an encounter of the redistribution and recognition claims. Indeed, the question is, which are the effects of this tension between an inevitable pluralism of struggles and the attempt to find a universalist frame of meta-critique, capable of bridging different cultural perspectives on emancipation. I think that the current complex scenario of emancipative social movements first calls into question the modern culture of critique and its idea of critical agency designed on the base of the Western, European, and American historical experiences. This means, of course, that we cannot consider a critical agency only as the empirical repertoire of the protest, but we have to question established modern notions of critique and emancipation. And this questioning concerns the way in which we know the critical agency embodied by social movements. Overall, this means to me, first, that this calls into question a sort of principle of totality as a sort of background idea of unique, universal, historical collective actor capable to recall or to replace the historical role of the working class movement or the transnational idea of the pressure of the earth, elaborated, for example, by Fanon during anti-colonial struggles. So the idea of a converging point beyond cultural differences. Second, to call into question, of course, Eurocentrism. The Eurocentrism of the Western sovereign subject, animated by a teleological emancipative ethos, and who was considered as the universalized model of any kind of critical agency, starting from the Western culture and expanding elsewhere. And third, to call into question the epistemic break given by the possibility of a gaze from nowhere, placed outside domination processes, considered as the only way out from false consciousness, offered to the subalterns who are not able to speak or to criticize by themselves. Concerning the dissolution of totality, we can see that it has been provoked by modernity itself, with its auto-confutative, auto-critical attitude, reaching its limits with the postmodernism, post-structuralism, the constructivism, and in social movements, this is related to at least two consequences. First, the questioning of critical agency as anti-systemic and structural aim, and the possibility of the breaking of the system limits, as Melucci used to call it. And second, the questioning of critical agency as pure negative dialectic, as radical anti-adaptive moment, for example, according to the interpretation of Marx given by the Frankfurt School. In social movements, this has represented, for example, by the trust in the autonomy of the activist and of the dissident as mere resource of the mobilization. Then we have to take into consideration, of course, that social movements are analytical objects constructed in a given cultural and theoretical environment, and they have been conceptualized mainly as from the experience of Western history. And yet nowadays, researchers and fieldworks are no longer exclusively Western, and research realized outside Western countries show that there is not a common culture of emancipation. For example, research in Western countries shows stronger connection between the individual and the community, or between the human and nature, in respect to the classical dualism of Western culture. And this means that the emancipative aims have to be situated in space and time, and that the history of emancipation is made also outside the cultural system of modernity. And finally, concerning the crisis of critique as epistemic break and pure demasking tool of false consciousness, this means that no one can claim the privilege to speak from a standpoint free from any kind of domination. And the consequence is also that social movements have to acknowledge the impossibility of this gaze from nowhere, culturelessness, genderlessness, and this has been more evident, for example, inside the feminist movements that have recognized that emancipation cannot be definitive, and this has been acknowledged also inside non-Western movements that so often have claimed that subalterns can speak and they are knowledge producers and not object of knowledge. A better investigation of the critical patterns of agencies and social movements could benefit of the encounter of three of the main theoretical terms in social sciences of the last decades: post-colonial thought, new materialist approaches, and theory of practice. And they attempt to overcome the dualism of modernity. From post-colonial thought comes the necessity to overcome the dualism modern or modern, emancipation tradition, and looking beyond a teleological and unidirectional idea of emancipation, recognizing that there are different historical and cultural trajectories of emancipation, avoiding self-referential attitudes and methodological nationalism. From new materialist studies comes the idea of bringing matter both as nature and as objects, into research to overcome modern purely epistemic and representational approaches to critical agency. More than new materialism as ontologism and flat approaches such as actor network theory, for example, probably is the neo-Marxian praxeological approach that can be more interesting in discussing critical agency. In this case, the idea of transforming oneself by transforming the social and material environment, as we can find already in the 11th thesis on Feuerbach by Marx. Basically, the idea that is that knowledge as praxis as knowledge, and in this case, critique consists in its own doing. It is immanent to the action, to the context. It is not a representation. Again, it is not a gaze from nowhere. And this is also well connected to the practice turn, for which critical agency is, first of all, a material practice. It consists in performativity, competencies, and capacities. And this underscores the importance of everyday micropolitics made by creative and pragmatic problem solving, by the capacity to work with and not only against the complexity of the processes. So this is in contrast with the more systemic and epistemic break as priority aim. So to conclude, to better investigate the way in which critical agencies are developed by contemporary social movements, we should perhaps acknowledge the difficulties to find a final synthesis of all the plurality and complexity of the intertwinements of contemporary claims and issues that cannot be resumed in a common epistemic point of view or in a unique idea of critique and emancipation. And yet, more than an epistemic common point of view, we can think about a material one, transversal to culture and situations, such as, for example, that of our common risk in the Anthropocene condition as a horizon not only of environmental risk, but also of insecurity and injustice in the exposition to risks. The necessity to work for the preservation of the natural and common goods goes in the direction of practices of commoning, connecting human agency with the material environment. And then there is, of course, the necessity to acknowledge the cultural differences of a pluralist society, and this means that social movements can be animated by different kinds of actors who can have different emancipative aims or different aspirations, usually less individualized than those of the modern Western culture. And finally, it is important to take into account the relevance of the micro and immanent scale of practices. The better understanding of situation with a cultural and material specificities can also help to construct a more stable transversal dialogues, bridging different experiences also from a transnational point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. So now we are going to take a few minutes, up to 10 minutes, for our invited discussant, Alf Nilsen, to come up here and give some reflections on these papers, which were really excellent. I had a chance to reread them and look at the slides as well. And it was really great to hear the oral presentations as well just now. I will give a little promo for a book if you're not familiar with his work as of yet. This is We Make Our Own History, co-authored with Lawrence Cox in 2014. And please welcome Alf.
All right, thanks to Ben for convening this panel, to panelists for excellent papers, and for a chance to engage with them. Now, rather than trying to address specific questions to 5 rich papers in 10 minutes, I wanted to offer a kind of a meta comment intended perhaps mostly as a provocation on the notion of relevance. Because that, of course, looms large in the title of this session, but hasn't really been addressed explicitly or raised explicitly in the papers, and I hope that might offer something to chew on in terms of the discussion ahead. Now, relevance, of course, is a question that relates to what or whose knowledge interests we address and serve in our work. What I call canonical social movement theory addresses scholastic knowledge questions. It's part of normal science, if we will. And therefore also very often, I would say consistently, fails to speak to activist knowledge interests. To give an example, I think it's relatively safe to say that there are very few activists who spend a whole lot of time considering the question whether their movement is old or new, for example. So what is it then that one could take as defining of the activist knowledge interest? I think it's a set of questions that can perhaps be outlined as follows, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. Firstly, of course, questions about the nature of the issues that they're mobilizing around. Secondly, questions about the opposition that they face from above, the resistance to their resistance, if you will. Thirdly, questions about links between their struggles and that of others elsewhere. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, questions about how to achieve change, most fundamentally about how to win. Now, to be relevant, then, it might very well be that we have to be willing to abandon the reductive conception of social movements that prevails among those that I refer to as the movement mafia, that is, the producers and purveyors of canonical movement studies, in which social movements tend to be defined as a fixed institutional level within a given political system. That fixed institutional level is typically the extra-parliamentary campaign or extra-parliamentary forms of collective action. Abandoning this understanding in turn entails considering social movements differently. So considering them firstly as animating forces in the making and unmaking of social order, which was, I think, a prominent theme in Madelaine's paper, and also as being animated by an intention to become more than what they currently are. And I want to emphasize that, because movements move, of course. It means that where social movements are at a given point in time is not necessarily the limit of where and how far is possible for them to go. And that might very well be a focal point for a movement research program that aspires to be relevant. That is, being relevant means being willing to abandon scholastic questions and instead producing knowledge that enables movements to develop expansively, to become more than what they currently are. Our knowledge production then is not necessarily qualitatively different from that which goes on inside social movements, producing what I have called elsewhere social movement or movement theory, knowledge that's produced to address oppressive and exploitative social structures and to change these structures. It means that we need to see ourselves as operating alongside with and in movements producing movement relevant theory. And I'd like to encourage the presenters to reflect upon how their specific interventions might be geared towards such a challenge. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we are about to get into some broader discussion, but Maria Martinez and I, in thinking about this session, we wanted to give you an opportunity to hear from the distributed papers as well, so you can get a little bit of a taste of the research, which we thought was very interesting, and then you could follow up as well to find out more. So we'll just take a few minutes to hear from Rumjung Hao Shi, or Ryan, talking about submissive resistance. Please welcome.
Dear professors and colleagues, I'm Rumjung Hao Shi from Tsinghua University, China, Department of Sociology. Thank you all for your inspiring and marvelous works. It is my great honor to present my research in such a large occasion. My presentation is more like a teaser or a trailer than an actual presentation. My study is not a complete journal paper, but a chapter of my recent dissertation on student movements in China post 1989. Students' collective action has persisted in China, contrary to, especially in elite universities, contrary to the lack of studies after Tiananmen pro-democracy protest. However, the participants' repertoire, mobilization, and their interaction with authorities has vastly changed. My study observed several appreciable collective action from 1996 to 2014 among students of Peking University, from which I graduated. Mainly focusing on the 90s. The students' action was generally limited within the campus, not public or widespread. They seemed self-interested, not value-oriented. The agents' mobilization fragmented, not extensive. Usually, their action ended in compromise between students and authorities, and were fraught with anomalous mechanism. These characteristics, of which I called submissive resistance, were non-existent in the 80s. Agents, as far as I'm concerned, agents cognizant of high cost of action and their vulnerability to the state and authorities will curtail certain repertoire and themes of resistance to reduce their action and the discourse into the dominant institutional field in hope of obtaining some legality and averting suppression from the authorities. In many cases, we have observed some peasants or city residents in China. They will waving the national flags, national constitution, or the party leaders' speeches to confront state police or the muscles that the government hides in many cases. After the 89 bloodshed, the state not only inhibits organized action, but also affects the agent's cognition and expectation. Such institutional structure creates irresolute participants and their incomplete participation. I propose the concept cognitive restraint to illustrate above-mentioned characteristics of student movements in China as a counterpoint to the political process theory. I want to examine the validity and the reliability of current theories in the context of non-democracy, as you may be aware, where the civil society is undeveloped and the political and social control over agents is severe. Thus, to describe the state-individual relation with so-called Chinese characteristics, and how it promotes or restrains the happening of collective action. As far as I'm concerned, the student movements in the 90s will be a great starting point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so we have microphones here on the floor, and I'm going to get off the stage, and what would be easiest, I don't think I'll be able to run around with them because they appear to be corded, is if you come up to a microphone, and we'll take 3 questions, and then we'll turn it over, and if we have time for another round, we'll do that. So just if you can come up to the front, to the microphones here, and we'll take 3 questions. Go ahead.
Einstein Forum in Potsdam, Germany. Thanks for a wonderful panel. I have questions or comments for the last paper and then the paper about hunger strikes. So I was wondering if you're aware of, and if so, what you think of the sociology of critique that comes out of French pragmatic sociology, which I think addresses a lot of the points that you listed. Specifically, the point about materiality, about engaging with different, including non-Western societies. So there's a lot of comparative work on Brazil, the US, France, Russia, Japan, etc. And also sort of empirically testing a new kind of social movement theory in all these different contexts and kind of taking different perspectives into account. About hunger strikes and spectacular speech as maybe emotional breaching events. I don't know if you'd consider using that term. You presented some very striking examples, but I'm wondering whether the conditions for, let's say, success or for the spectacularity of these kinds of acts might be different in different kinds of societies and political systems. Right now in Russia, there's a Ukrainian film director who's been imprisoned after being essentially kidnapped in the Crimea and has been on hunger strike for over 2 months. And, you know, a lot of people in a very small circle are extremely worked up about this. But I think that even internationally and also within Russia, not many people are even paying attention. Even though in a different kind of setting, this might be very spectacular. And I'm sure that there would be, you know, we could name lots of other examples of something having a similar structure to what you showed us, but not having in any way the same kind of effect. If only because, you know, if we had the kind of setting that you showed in this video clip, you know, in a lot of countries, immediately the police or the riot police would swarm in and stop this kind of discussion. Right? So, to what extent do you think that what you said about spectacular speeches, spectacular hunger strikes, and spectacular acts might be applicable to, you know, non-Western, non-democratic countries?
Well, and that was a well-modeled question. Introduce yourself, that was good, and direct the questions if you can. We'll take 2 more, and then we'll bring it back up.
Thanks so much for any paper which was presented. I'm coming from Germany. I'm an educational scientist, social worker, and feminist, and scholar activist in diverse ways. And I just want to add the offer of a bridging to another field which could really brought together with your reflections, which is the issue of, some of you mentioned it already, internal movements within movements, the movements within movements, and especially the issue of conflictual issues within movements, which could function as a source of new knowledge and new insight and new critique as a kind of self-critique also, and to develop further what the movement is about and how it's moving. And what I want only to suggest, because I'm subjected to ask a lot of questions and commenting on a lot of things, which I don't, but take into account, like following the biographies, for example, but I don't mean only that. The transformation processes going on within, and the persons, the individuals, the collectives, the dynamics, in the sense of a Bildungsprozess. It's difficult to translate, but transformative processes, how are people who want to make a change changed themselves by their activism? That would be an interesting point of view, maybe to relate to also. Thanks.
One more, and my advisor, Richard Flax, would like your comment. One more.
Hi, Joost Moore, Kiel University. Thanks for a range of interesting presentations. I have a cluster of questions or suggestions for Helena. I think I'm dealing with a number of the same challenges that you are describing in your presentation, so it's interesting to see. My background is, in this case, especially in research on the climate movement, and that's maybe my first comment. I didn't hear you mention anything about the climate movement, whereas I think that is sort of one of the main transnational social movements. Also, if you look at it historically, I think a lot of the people who were active in the global justice movement continued in the climate movement, so that's probably something to take into account. One of the questions that I'm struggling with, and that I'd like to hear your idea on, is first of all, what should we interpret transnational social movement to be? And it has, until now, it seems to me, mainly been understood as we define a social movement at a local or national level, and then when we see that it does something in another country or targets an international organization, we start calling it a transnational social movement. The alternative would be to look at movements that at a transnational level are capable of building collective identities and dense networks of interactions, so that we are really talking about a movement at the transnational level rather than the social movement that has a transnational element. And because you didn't, as far as I could hear, not really identify what transnational social movement was, I thought you could maybe tell us a bit more about how you think about that. And then finally, one of the things why I was interested in transnational social movements was that I thought, especially in the context of the climate movement, it's sort of obvious, like it's a global problem, so it requires a global solution, so probably everybody wants a global movement. Actually, when I talk to a lot of activists, it's not so obvious that they want that. Like it's maybe something desirable, but in the context of limited resources and trade-offs and investments that you can only make once, etc. Again, that's maybe very economic language, but at the end of the day, social movements have limited resources, so they need to be smart about how they spend them. And a lot of activists actually say a global movement would be nice, but we cannot prioritize it. It would cost too many resources. The outcomes are too uncertain. And so that is maybe something to keep in mind when we design research on transnational social movements, that movements themselves might have very different views on it, and that actually regional movements are often more efficient in that sense. So I'll
Great. Wonderful. Do we want to just go down the row, maybe start with Maarit? Does that work? And give you each a chance to respond or pass it, whatever you want. A lot of them were specific, but also because of time, I want to make sure I could your chance. Or you could also respond to what Alf contributed, if you'd like to.
Okay. Well, I'll just comment briefly on the issue that was actually raised by both of the two last commenters. Is this like how the movements themselves define themselves, and so on and so forth. So and making also how the research is meaningful. And I think this has I've read quite a bit about this, how to make it meaningful for them. But I think it's also very much a methodological question. For example, my ethnography is to be distributed back to the activists in a very, very different way. I mean, I lived with them, I shared with them my life, so they're my friends. I just go to have a beer with them and discuss, and we can develop together things like how to do something better next time. So it's very different. I cannot answer that for another method. And the other thing is like this language question, which I said that I try to use the words that the activists use by themselves in order to appreciate how they have chosen to call different things within the movement, but also acknowledging that there are these like theoretical terms and so on and so forth, and also the contradictions between these two, but also within both theoretical and their practical lives.
I may ask the third question about the environmental issues. One of my advisors actually working on the environmental protection, environmental sociology in China. From my perspective, the environmental issues can't evolve into a worldwide issue from many perspectives, like nationalism or the political struggles like that. In the case of China, the Chinese government recently has working very hard on the world environmental protection activism. Not because it's as far as I'm concerned, not because it really cared about something like carbon dioxide issues or something like that. Because it want to protect, it want to play a more leading role in international interaction, especially in the era of Trump. You will get that. And in the 80s, I believe that the Chinese government had signed a lot of conventions and treaties about environmental protections to expand its international influence on many occasions. So it will be political, not just a social or activity problem, I think. Yeah.
So I just want to can you hear me okay? I want to read you this quote by Stokely Carmichael. He says, Dr. King's policy was that nonviolence would achieve the gains for Black people in the United States. His major assumption was if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and be moved to change your heart. That's very good. He made only one fallacious assumption. In order to have nonviolence work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none. So I'm making the supposition that depends. So what I'm saying there, what I think he's saying is that your target, that's the social movement language, you've got to think about who your target is. Does your target really have a conscience or not? University of California in 1994 didn't want to have students die. So they said, we've got to do something about this. Presumably in Russia or Ukraine or whatever kind of other context, and I'm really glad you brought that up. Unfortunately, hunger strikes are like a dime a dozen. There's so many hunger strikes that are going on. There's lots of cases of self-immolation as well. And it's sort of like if a tree drops in the forest, that's a bad metaphor with earth first. But if a tree drops in the forest, does anybody really hear it? If somebody's doing a tree sitting or if somebody's doing something radical, somebody's doing something spectacular, there's ways to muffle their speech. You can just simply pull the plug on them, right? You need to do something to kind of what they call scale up, to amplify your voice. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. If your target, your state, or whoever you're facing says, we're going to do everything to crush you and to sort of like silence your voice, then of course you have to do something else to be heard. What would that be? I'm not really sure. I think it's happened time and time again.
Okay. So the question about French critical theory. Yes, I know, of course, that it represents the main renewal of critical thought in the last decades. The problem is that there are no specific connection between this literature and the literature of social movements theory that has. Yes, it's I mean, it's perhaps a starting dialogue, but it's true that social movement theory till nowadays has been quite self-referential. And moreover, inside French critical pragmatic critique, there are important differences. I mean, the Boltanski side is perhaps quite different in respect to the anthropological side of the Schola, and the one is more materialist and perhaps more less interested in the issue of critique, and the Boltanski, of course, for many reasons related also to his past relationships with Bourdieu, is much more related to previous critical thought. But this is, of course, a field that in which a dialogue, an interesting dialogue, would be developed. But overall, my aim was just to start a cartography of this lack of connection, of strong connection between these two sides of the theory, social movements and the tradition of critical thought in general, and more specifically in respect to the modern history of this critical thought.
I'm not going to what it was. I'm going to respond to Alf and relevance, because I think this is an issue that both me and I, I'm going to speak for a little bit here as well, have been dealing with a lot, because we both come from activist backgrounds. I worked in the labour movement in Australia before academia. And what I found interesting when I first read social movement literature, it was like, SWOT analysis and stuff, which is what we were doing anyway, So it's like, what is new here? Or what is helpful here? I didn't find anything helpful from an activist brain, And so, then you go back to kind of theory, and you're thinking, okay, well, how do I situate this, and where is my role in this? Because I don't want to just be researching you as the zoo. I also think as a researcher, I have a role in these movements, especially as the movements I'm looking at are still somewhat contemporary. I think also as a historian, you have that role as well, because you're making people remember that what is maybe deemed as natural now was not before, you know. And I think that's part of your role as researcher and relevance, is to produce that historiography as well as critique and be, you know, I have the time, the money and the space now to have that reflection process of those movements that can then be fed back in, you know. And I think when you're talking about scholastic knowledge, I think there's an issue here, because I don't want to just be producing knowledge for the activists. I think the activists have that knowledge, you know, and they have that. But what is my role in the university is as a teacher. And I think a lot of people or students, their first interaction with activism can be in the classroom. And so therefore I need to be producing knowledge or work that makes them think critically about those subjects beyond what they might be getting taught in more mainstream social movements or political science. I think it's this balance, and it's a really hard balance to kind of navigate, but it's something I'm always very conscious of at the start.
Okay. Yes, I'm sorry for not including climate change movement in that overview. It's under that book on Japan, the Kyoto protocols and so on, they are in there. But I will change the slide. Thank you. I think you know, I don't know if this name still tells anybody here anything, but Touraine, the French social movement theorist and sociologist, he believed very much in interventionist sociology, and in one of his books he actually describes his meetings with mostly anti-nuclear movement groups, and how he tried to tell them what they should do. Now this is apropos your question. It's a question, as an activist, you can tell your buddies that they should do more linkages with other movements in other countries, and you can also explain to them that it's very inexpensive and doesn't, I mean, the examples that I offered, it's the same, this actually is a reaction also to what you said. Now, how can we contribute? We can contribute by saying that it's very cheap to use internet to link up, but there are also some studies about past historical conflicts that hinder that. So one thing is, are you an activist, a colleague that can appear, that can sort of argue for something, or do you come as a scientist? We know that as a social movement researcher, as a scientist, your position may be defined as that of an external actor whose advice is undesired. That's a problem. And the other problem on which there is quite a bit of research is historical past. It has been very difficult for Japanese and South Korean pacifists, for example, to work together. And so I'm saying, yes, it is a problem, but of course it is desirable. I can only agree. It's desirable that on global issues there are transnational movements.
Thank you so much to each of our paper presenters for your work. Thanks to all of you for this excellent discussion. And please, final round of applause. A great learning experience.